I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was sitting at my desk, debating whether to tell Nero Wolfe that the bank balance was starting to look like a modest retirement fund rather than the operating capital for a West 35th Street brownstone when the doorbell rang. It was 9:14 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, a time usually reserved for the delivery of oversized orchid crates or the arrival of a bill that Wolfe would inevitably ignore until the second notice. I peeked through the one-way glass in the front door. Standing on the stoop was a man who looked like had been ironed flat and then starched for good measure. He was in his 50s, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first 3 cars combined, and clutching a leather briefcase as if it contained the secret to cold fusion. He wasn't vibrating, but he had the kind of stillness that suggests a man is about to implode. I opened the door. Good morning. If you're selling life insurance, we're immortal. If it's anything else, you'd better have a very good reason for interrupting a man's breakfast. I am Silas Thorne, he said, his voice as dry as a desert bone. I must see Mr. Wolfe. It is a matter of extreme delicacy regarding the estate of the late Julian Vane. The name Julian Vane meant something, even to a guy who spends his time looking at ledgers and dodging the local precinct. Vane had been the kind of billionaire who traded smaller billionaires for sport. 3 days ago, had been found dead in his private library in Greenwich. The papers had called it heart failure, but the rumours in the back of the Times suggested the heart failure had been preceded by a very locked door and a very missing will. Mr. Wolfe is with his orchids, I said, checking my watch. He'll be down at 11. Between 9 and 11, he wouldn't come down for the Queen of Sheba, and she's a lot more decorative than a lawyer in charcoal grey. Thorne didn't move. I cannot wait until 11. I am the executor of Julian's estate, and as of 20 minutes ago, I am also the primary suspect in a murder investigation that hasn't officially started yet. I have a check for $5,000 in my pocket as a retainer. Does that improve the schedule? It improves my mood, I told him, stepping aside. Come in, sit in the red leather chair and try not to look like you're guilty of anything more than being a lawyer. I'll see if I can convince the boss that a billionaire's ghost is worth a trip down the elevator. I went to the house phone and buzzed the plant rooms. It took a minute for Wolfe to respond, and when he did, he sounded like he'd just been told his favourite beer was out of stock. Yes, Archie. I am in the middle of a delicate repotting of a cattleya. Sorry to disturb the greenery, but Silas Thorne is in the office. He's talking about Julian Vane's estate, a locked library, and a $5,000 retainer. He looks like he's ready to jump out of his own skin, and he's currently occupying your favourite chair. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of the misting system. Vane, Wolfe muttered, a man of profound greed and even more profound secrecy. He once tried to buy my Parthia pedilum for a price that was an insult to the flower's dignity. What does Thorne want? He says he's a suspect. He says the library was locked from the inside, but the will is gone. And he says he needs you before the police decide that natural causes is a polite way of saying poisoned by his attorney. Wolfe sighed, a sound like a distant locomotive. 5 minutes, Archie. Tell Mr. Thorne that if he is lying to me, I shall double the fee and then hand him to Inspector Cramer on a silver platter. And tell Fritz we shall have the poached eggs with truffle oil for lunch. The morning has already become quite stale. When Wolfe descended, he didn't look at Thorne. He walked straight to his custom-built chair, settled his 1/7 of a ton into the reinforced springs, and fixed his gaze on a spot about 6 inches above Thorne's head. Mr. Thorne, Wolfe began, his voice a melodic rumble, you have disrupted my routine. You have brought the stench of a Greenwich scandal into my office, and you have mentioned a locked room. I find locked rooms to be a tedious affectation of the unimaginative. Explain why I should care about Julian Vane's inability to keep breathing. Thorne leaned forward, his hands tight on his briefcase. Because, Mr. Wolfe, the door was bolted from the inside. There are no other exits. And yet, the safe behind Vane's mother's portrait was open. The new will, which disinherited his entire family in favour of a botanical foundation, is gone. The police think I have it. They think I killed him to protect my own interests in the firm. But I didn't. I was in the hallway trying to get him to sign a merger agreement when I heard him fall. Wolfe's eyes opened a fraction of an inch. A botanical foundation. Vane didn't know a petunia from a parsnip. He knew that his children were vipers, Thorne said. He wanted to spite them. He told me the will was his final joke. But now the joke is on me. If that will isn't found, the old one stands, and the vipers get everything, and I go to Sing Sing. Wolfe grunted, a sound of mild, almost imperceptible interest. He looked at the check Thorne had placed on the desk, then at me. Archie, it seems we are to be the executors of a dead man's malice. Get the names of the vipers, and tell Fritz the truffles must be fresh. I have a feeling this case will require a very sharp palate. The brownstone has a way of absorbing tension like a sponge, but even its sturdy walls seemed to lean inward as the Vane family filed into the office. I had spent the last hour on the phone with various contacts, including a very grumpy sergeant in Greenwich, to ensure that the vipers Silas Thorne mentioned were properly summoned. They arrived in a fleet of black sedans that made the street look like the staging ground for a high-end funeral. I showed them one by one, watching their eyes dart around the room, looking for the man who was currently sitting behind the desk like a monument to sedentary power. First was Arthur Vane, the eldest son, who had the kind of polished Ivy League exterior that usually hides a heart made of cold slush. He took the chair nearest the window and immediately began inspecting his fingernails. Behind him came Madeline Vane, a woman whose pearls were probably worth more than my annual salary, and whose expression suggested she had just smelled something dying in the walls. The youngest, Gregory, looked like he had been poured into a tailored suit after a 3-day bender. He didn't sit so much as collapse into the yellow chair, smelling faintly of expensive gin and resentment. Finally, there was the wild card, Julian's personal secretary, a man named Sterling Vance, who possessed a face as unreadable as a blank sheet of paper, and a posture that screamed of secrets kept for a high price. Wolfe didn't rise to greet them. He rarely does, as the physics of moving his 1/7 of a ton of bulk is a matter of state importance. He sat with his eyes half closed, his fingers performing a slow, rhythmic tap on the arms of his chair. The silence in the room grew heavy, the kind of silence that has weight and texture, until even Arthur stopped looking at his nails. "You have all come," Wolfe said, his voice a dry, melodic rumble that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. "Not out of respect for your late father, I suspect, but out of a shared, desperate terror of his memory. Mr. Thorne tells me that Julian Vane died in a room bolted from the inside. He also tells me that a will has vanished, a will that would have rendered your various ambitions quite moot." "It's a lie," Madeline snapped, her voice like a thin blade of glass. "There was no other will. Silas Thorne is trying to manufacture a mystery to cover up the fact that he was the last person to see my father alive. He's been bleeding the estate for years, and he knew Julian was finally onto him." Gregory let out a short, jagged laugh from the yellow chair. "Oh, come off it, Maddie. We all knew the old man was looking for a way to cut us. He hated the way Arthur handled the firm. He hated your second husband, and he hated my lifestyle. If he could have taken the money with him to the grave, he would have had it buried in the coffin. A botanical foundation. That sounds exactly like his brand of humor." Arthur Vane looked toward Wolfe, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Wolfe, you are a man of logic. Consider the facts. The library was a fortress. The safe was behind a painting that was wired to a silent alarm. No one entered that room after Silas Thorne left it at 10 o'clock. My father was found at midnight. If a will is missing, it's because it never existed, or because the man who was alone with him that night made sure it wouldn't be found." Wolfe opened his eyes a fraction of an inch, his gaze settling on Sterling Vance, the secretary who had been standing silently by the door. "And you, Mr. Vance, you were the keeper of Julian's schedule. You were the man who filed his secrets and managed his correspondence. Did you see this supposed botanical will?" Vance didn't flinch. "I saw Julian working on a document 3 days before his death. He didn't show me the contents, but he did ask me to look up the tax status of several conservation groups. He was in a remarkably good mood, the kind of mood he only got into when he was about to make someone very unhappy." Wolfe grunted, a sound of mild, almost imperceptible interest. He shifted his weight, and the oversized chair groaned in sympathy. "A circle of 4, Wolfe remarked, his gaze sweeping the room. 5, including the ghost of Julian Vane. You have provided me with a wealth of motives, ranging from the preservation of wealth to the simple satisfaction of revenge, but the mechanics of the matter remain offensive to my sensibilities. A bolted door, an open safe, a missing document. Information does not simply evaporate, and paper does not walk through steel. "Are you taking the case, or just lecturing us?" Arthur asked, standing up. "Because if you're working for Thorne, you're working for a man who is currently under the microscope of the district attorney." "I do not work for people, Mr. Vane," Wolfe said, his voice taking on a rare edge of steel. "I work for the truth, and I find it quite intolerable when it is hidden behind a cheap parlor trick. You will all leave your contact information with Mr. Goodwin, and you will stay in town. I shall require another gathering soon, and I suspect the air in this office will be even more crowded than it is now." As I led the silent, fuming quartet toward the front door, I caught Wolfe staring at the painting on the far wall of one of the mountain landscape he liked. He wasn't looking at the art, though. He was looking at the emptiness of the space where the suspects had been. The vipers had left their scent in the room, a mixture of expensive perfume and the cold sweat of people who had everything to lose. I shut the front door and threw the bolt. I walked back into the office and leaned against my desk. "So," I said, "a locked room, a missing joke of a will, and a room full of people who would have happily pushed the old man off a pier for a nickel. Where do we start? Or are we waiting for the truffles to give us an epiphany?" Wolfe didn't look up. "The truffles are for sustenance, Archie, not revelation. We start with the physical. A bolted door is a fact, but a fact can be a lie if the observer is looking at the wrong part of the room. You will go to Greenwich. I want a description of every object in that library, not just the books and the safe, but the trivialities. The dust, the air, the smell of the carpet. And Archie, find out what Julian Vane was reading the night his heart decided to stop." "Reading?" I asked, grabbing my hat. "You think he bored himself to death?" "Julian Vane didn't do anything without an audience, even when he was alone," Wolfe said, closing his eyes again. "Go, and do not come back until you can tell me why a man who is about to die would leave a safe open in a locked room." The drive to Greenwich was the kind of trip that reminds you why some people prefer the subway. The traffic was thick, and the air in Connecticut had a way of smelling like money that's been sitting in a vault too long. The Vane estate, a sprawling pile of stone and glass that looked like a fortress designed by a paranoid architect, sat perched on a cliff overlooking the Sound. I spent 40 minutes convincing a uniformed officer that my credentials were more important than his orders, and eventually I was standing in the center of the library where Julian Vane had breathed his last. It was a room that would have made Wolfe weep with envy or rage, depending on the bindings. 3 walls were lined with mahogany shelves reaching toward a vaulted ceiling, stuffed with the kind of rare editions that people buy to look at rather than read. The 4th wall was a floor-to-ceiling window offering a view of the water, currently grey and choppy. The door ID entered was a massive slab of oak with a heavy brass bolt on the inside. I tested it. When that bolt was thrown, you weren't getting in without a battering ram or a very persuasive stick of dynamite. I started with the safe. It was hidden behind a portrait of Vane's mother, a woman who looked like Shed, enjoyed a good scandal as much as a glass of gin. The safe door was hanging open, its interior as empty as a politician's promise. There were no scratches on the dial, no signs of forced entry. Whoever had opened it knew the combination or had been invited in. But the room was locked from the inside. I moved to the desk. It was a clean surface save for a green-shaded lamp and a single book lying open face down. I picked it up, being careful with the spine. It wasn't a thriller or biopic. It was a centuries-old volume on the history of English knot gardens. I made a note of it. Wolfe had asked what he was reading, and apparently the old man's final interests had been horticultural. The floor was covered in a Persian rug so thick it felt like walking on a cloud. I got down on my hands and knees, much to the amusement of the detective in the hallway, who was watching me through the cracked door. I wasn't looking for a will, I was looking for the trivialities Wolfe had insisted upon. I found a tiny, almost microscopic shard of blue glass near the edge of the desk. I tucked it into a small envelope. Further along near the window, there was a faint, circular indentation in the rug, as if something heavy had been sitting there recently, something about the size of a silver dollar. The most interesting thing, however, wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. The library had a fireplace, A massive stone hearth that looked like it could roast an ox. There were no ashes. The grate was scrubbed clean. In a house this size in the middle of a brisk Connecticut autumn, a clean fireplace is an abnormality. I checked the wood basket. It was full of seasoned oak, but the logs were dusty. I spent another hour interviewing the staff. The cook was a nervous wreck, the maid was in tears, and the butler, a man named Henderson, looked like he'd been carved out of the same mahogany as the shelves. Henderson confirmed that Vane had entered the library at 9 o'clock, bolted the door as was his custom, and hadn't been heard from again until the body was found at midnight. "Did anyone else have a key?" I asked. "No one, Mr. Goodwin." Mr. Vane was very particular about his privacy. Even the cleaning staff were only allowed in under his direct supervision. "And the window?" Henderson shook his head. "Bulletproof glass, sir. It doesn't open. The ventilation is handled through the central system." I headed back to the city, my head spinning with a collection of facts that didn't want to play nice with each other. A dead man, a locked door, a book about gardens, a shard of blue glass, and a fireplace that was too clean for comfort. By the time I walked back into the office on 35th Street, Wolfe was at his desk, having finished his lunch, and currently occupied with a beer. I laid it all out for him. I put the shard of glass on the blotter, described the indentation in the rug, and mentioned the clean fireplace. Wolfe didn't move a muscle, but his eyes followed the shard of glass as if it were a rare jewel. "The book, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a low, vibrating bass. "You said it was about not gardens." "Page 42, I said, checking my notebook. It was open to a diagram of a hedge maze. Wolfe's fingers began tapping the arm of his chair. It was a slow, rhythmic sound that meant the gears were turning at a high velocity. A hedge maze, a locked room, a shard of cobalt glass, and a fireplace that has been scrubbed of its history. "You make it sound like it makes sense," I said, sitting at my desk. "To me, it sounds like the old man was playing games right up until the end." "He was not playing a game, Archie. He was conducting an experiment," Wolfe remarked, his gaze shifting to the painting on the wall. Julian Vane knew the vipers were coming. He knew the room was a fortress, and he knew that a fortress is only as strong as the man who holds the key. The will did not walk out of that room. It was transformed. "Transformed? You think he ate it?" Wolfe ignored the sarcasm. "Go back to your desk. Call Mr. Sterling Vance. I want to know his hobbies. Specifically, I want to know if he has ever shown an interest in chemistry or glass making. And Archie, call Saul Panzer. I have a mission for him that involves a very specific type of refuse." "Refuse?" I asked, reaching for the phone. "You want Saul to go through the trash." "Not the trash, Archie, the chimney. I want Saul to examine the flue of the Vane library from the roof. If the fireplace was clean, the evidence of what was burned there will be found in the soot." I started dialing. The academic fog was starting to thicken, but Wolfe was already moving through it with the certainty of a man who has seen the exit before anyone else has even found the door. The vipers were still out there, thinking they had won, but they had forgotten one thing. Nero Wolfe doesn't care about the money, but he has a very long memory for a slight against the truth. I spent the next morning playing the part of a curious biographer, which is a role I can handle as long as the person I am talking to doesn't ask for a list of my publications. My first stop was a small, high-end shop in the East 60s that sold the kind of chemistry sets that aren't for kids, unless the kids have a trust fund and a license to handle volatiles. It took 15 minutes of charm and the mention of a potential large-scale institutional order to get the clerk to open up about Sterling Vance. "Mr. Vance," the clerk said, polishing a glass beaker. "Oh yes, a very meticulous gentleman. He's a regular. He doesn't go for the standard reagents. He's quite into specialized glasswork fusing and tempering. He bought a portable butane torch and a set of cobalt-tinted rods about 6 months ago. Said he was interested in the molecular structure of historical glazes. A very intellectual hobby, if you ask me. I thanked him and moved on to my next target, Arthur Vane's social club. You can tell a lot about a man by how the people who serve him his scotch look at his back when he leaves the room. I caught the head barman during the quiet hour before the lunch rush. It turned out Arthur had been under a considerable amount of pressure lately. The Ivy League exterior was apparently being held together by Scotch tape and a lot of borrowed capital. Had been seen having several quiet, intense meetings with Julian's lawyer Snot Thorne, but the junior associates who handled the offshore accounts, By the time I headed back to the brownstone, the city was sweating under a grey, humid sky that felt like a wet wool blanket. I found Wolfe in the office, but he wasn't alone. Saul Panzer was there, looking like a man who had just spent the morning climbing through a coal mine. He had a small plastic bag on the desk filled with a grey, gritty substance that I assumed was the refuse Wolfe had been so keen on. Saul had a productive climb, Wolfe said, his voice sounding almost cheerful, which for him is a sign that someone is about to have a very bad afternoon. The flue was indeed scrubbed, but a chimney is a cavernous thing. Near the damper, where the brush could not reach, he found this. "Archie, tell me what you found regarding Mr. Vance's intellectual hobbies." I laid out the story of the cobalt rods and the butane torch. I also mentioned Arthur Vane's financial wobbles and his back-channel meetings. Wolfe listened, his eyes half closed, his fingers performing that slow, rhythmic dance on the arms of his chair. "So," I said, leaning against the desk, "Vance has chemistry and blue glass. Arthur has the motive to make a will disappear, but was still stuck with a door that was bolted from the inside. Unless Vance can turn into smoke and float through the ventilation, he wasn't in that room when the old man died, and Thorne says he was in the hallway." "The door is the distraction," Archie, Wolfe remarked, his gaze settling on the bag of soot Saul had brought. "The vipers have been so busy watching the bolt that they have forgotten to look at the atmosphere. Saul, what did you find in the soot besides the carbon?" Saul leaned forward, his sharp, intelligent eyes bright. "Tiny bits of metallic foil, Mr. Wolfe, and a residue that smelled faintly of magnesium. It wasn't just paper that went up in that fireplace. It was something that burns hot and fast like a flare, but more controlled." Wolfe grunted, a sound of profound satisfaction. "A magnesium flash, a hedge maze in a book, a shard of cobalt glass, and a will that disinherits the world in favor of flowers. The geometry is almost complete. It's Greek to me," I admitted. "If the will is burned, vipers win. The old will stands, and Arthur and the rest of them get the bank accounts." "Why would the killer burn the very thing they need to prove Thorne is a liar?" "They didn't burn the will to prove a lie, Archie. They burned it because the will was never meant to be read. It was meant to be seen." Wolfe shifted his weight, and the chair gave its usual groan of protest. Julian Vane was a man of cold ledgers, yes, but he was also a man of immense ego. He wanted to watch his children's faces when they realized they were beggars. He created a theatrical masterpiece, but he didn't account for a spectator who understood the stagecraft better than he did. The doorbell rang, cutting through the silence of the office. I checked the glass. It was Madeline Vane, looking even more fragile than she had the day before. She was alone, and she didn't look like she was there for a social call. "Show her in," Archie, Wolfe commanded, "and Saul, go to the kitchen. Fritz has prepared a snack that I believe you will find more palatable than chimney soot. I shall have a use for you shortly." As I led Madeline Vane into the office, I noticed she was clutching her handbag with a grip that made her knuckles white. She looked at Wolfe, then at me, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for a trap. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, her voice trembling. "I found something in my father's bedroom." It was in his humidor note. It mentioned Sterling Vance and a final payment for the Greenwich illusion. "I don't know what it means, but I'm afraid. I think Sterling didn't just work for my father. I think he was helping him disappear." Wolfe didn't blink. He took the note she offered, a small, crumpled slip of paper, and laid it on the blotter. He didn't even look at it. He looked at Madeline. "The illusion is nearly over, Mrs. Vane, but I suspect you will find the reality far less comforting than the mystery." I watched her face, looking for a crack, but she was as cold as the pearls around her neck. The academic fog was finally starting to clear, and I could see the outline of the mountain Wolfe was climbing. It wasn't who entered the room. It was about who never had to. The office was quiet after Madeline Vane's departure, but it was the kind of quiet that precedes a landslide. Wolfe remained motionless for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the note she had left on his desk. To a casual observer, he was merely being stubborn, but I knew the signs. He was integrating the Greenwich illusion into a mental framework that was already dangerously complete. I moved to the cabinet to check the bottle of bourbon, mostly to give myself something to do while the gears in the chair next to me ground through the implications of magnesium and hedge mazes. "It's a nice phrase," I said, breaking the silence. "The Greenwich illusion. Sounds like a magic trick. Maybe Vane didn't die at all. Maybe he just turned into a puff of smoke and a bouquet of flowers. Do not be fatuous, Archie. It is a vice, Wolfe snapped, though his eyes remained closed. Mr. Vane is undeniably dead. The illusion does not concern his mortality, but the perception of his environment. A man who bolts himself into a room is not merely seeking privacy, he is creating a controlled laboratory. But even the most secure laboratory is subject to the laws of physical displacement. He opened his eyes and looked at the clock. It was nearly 4, the hour of his afternoon session with the orchids. He stood upper monumental event that always makes the floorboards of the brownstone groan in weary respect and headed for the elevator. I shall be upstairs, he announced. Do not disturb me unless the house is breached. And Archie, keep a sharp eye on the office. When scorpions realize they are being observed, they often attempt to sting the glass of their cage. I took the hint. I didn't go to the kitchen to chat with Fritz or Saul. Instead, I stayed at my desk, ostensibly working on the previous month's expense reports, but really keeping a sensory net cast over the hallway. The brownstone is a sanctuary, but even a sanctuary can be violated if the person outside is desperate enough. The trespass happened at exactly 5:15 a.m. I didn't hear a window break or a lock being picked. I heard the soft, muffled click of the service entrance door in the basement. It's a sound that shouldn't happen when Fritz is in the middle of prepping a leg of lamb. I stayed in my chair, my hands sliding toward the drawer where I keep the Marley, and waited. A few minutes later, the office door creaked open just a fraction. A figure slipped inside, moving with a practiced, predatory quiet. It wasn't one of the Vane children. It was Sterling Vance. He didn't see me in the shadows of the corner, or perhaps he thought I was as sedentary as my employer. He moved straight for Wolfe's desk, his eyes fixed on the small bag of chimney soot and the shard of cobalt glass ID left on the blotter. Looking for a souvenir, Sterling? I asked, clicking the desk lamp. Vance jumped as if ID plugged him into a wall socket. He spun around, his face a mask of calculated neutrality that was currently failing him. He didn't have a gun, but he was clutching a small, heavy object in his right hand, a brass paperweight from the hallway table. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, his voice regaining its cool, thin edge. "I didn't realize you were still in the office. I was merely concerned. Silas Thorne told me that Mr. Wolfe had recovered some items from the estate. I wanted to ensure they were being handled with the proper care." "We're big on care here," I said, leaning back in my chair and keeping my hand visible, but near the drawer. "Also big on manners. Usually people ring the bell. Entering through the basement is more of a delivery entrance move. What's so special about a bit of soot and some broken glass?" Vance's eyes flickered toward the bag. "Nothing. Unless you don't understand what you're looking at. Julian was a man of many secrets, Mr. Goodwin. Some of them are better left in the chimney. Is that why you tried to steam open the safe before the police arrived?" I asked, taking a shot in the dark based on the scars Saul had mentioned. "Or were you just trying to retrieve the Greenwich illusion before the curtain came down?" Vance didn't answer. He set the paperweight back down on the desk with a hand that was surprisingly steady. "You and Mr. Wolfe are playing a dangerous game. The Vane family is not known for its patience. If you continue to poke at the ashes, you might find yourselves caught in the fire." He turned and walked out, not through the basement this time, but through the front door, which I made sure to bolt behind him. I went back to the office and looked at the desk. At first glance, nothing was missing. The soot was there, the glass was there, and Madeline's note was exactly where Wolfe had left it. But then I noticed its shard of cobalt glass had been moved. It was sitting on top of the note now, precisely over the word illusion, and there was something else, a small white smudge on the dark mahogany of the desk. I leaned in and sniffed. It wasn't dust and it wasn't ash. It was the faint, chalky scent of magnesium carbonate. I looked at the ceiling. "He didn't come to take anything," I muttered to the empty room. "He came to see how much we knew, and he just gave us the final piece of the puzzle." When Wolfe came down at 6, I told him about the visit. I told him about the magnesium on the desk and the way Vance had looked at the glass. Wolfe didn't seem surprised. He sat in his chair and looked at the white smudge with a grim, almost satisfied expression. "A subtle trespass indeed," Archie, Wolfe remarked. "Mr. Vance is a man of intellectual vanity. He could not resist the urge to see if I had deciphered his stagecraft. He has confirmed the method, but he has also revealed the motive. He did not kill Julian Vane for money. He killed him for the same reason a magician kills a rival to ensure his own trick remains the only one the audience remembers. So he did use the magnesium, I asked. He used it to create the only thing a locked room cannot defend against, Wolfe said. A mirage. Archie, call Saul Panzer. I have a mission for him. He is to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I want him to speak to the curator of the photography wing. I want to know about the properties of early 20th century flash powders and their effect on cobalt-tinted lenses. I reached for the phone. The fog wasn't just clearing, it was being burned away by a very specific, very bright light. The Vipers were still there, but the man in the brownstone had just found the switch. The following morning, the brownstone felt less like a residence and more like the interior of a clock where the mainspring had been wound to the point of snapping. Wolfe had descended from the plant rooms 10 minutes early, a disruption of the natural law that had Fritz looking at the kitchen clock with genuine concern. Saul Panzer had checked in at dawn, his voice crackling over the phone with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent the night in the shadows of the Met and come away with the keys to the kingdom. Wolfe was behind his desk, the small bag of chimney soot and the cobalt shard arranged before him like ritual offerings. He didn't look at me when I brought in the morning mail. He was staring at the white magnesium smudge ID discovered on the mahogany the night before. His fingers were performing a slow, rhythmic tap, a silent percussion that signaled the final stages of a mental grand master's game. Archie, Wolfe said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. The mission for Saul was successful. The curator was most illuminating. It seems that cobalt-tinted lenses, when used in conjunction with a magnesium-rich flash powder, can create a momentary optical saturation of visual whiteout that leaves the eye temporarily blinded to certain spectrums of light. For a period of several seconds, an observer looking through such a lens would see only a void where a brightly lit object once stood. I sat at my desk and pulled a fresh notebook toward me. So we're back to magic tricks. Vance uses the flash to hide what? Safe himself. He wasn't in the room, remember? Thorne was in the hallway, and the door was bolted. He was not hiding himself, Archie. He was hiding the exit, Wolfe remarked, his gaze shifting to the painting on the wall. But the flash was only the second act of the play. The first act was witness tampering. Silas Thorne is a man of precise habits and deteriorating eyesight. He relies on a very specific pair of reading glasses, does he not? He was wearing them when he arrived, I noted. Thick lenses, gold frames. He looked like he'd have trouble finding his own feet without them. Precisely. And Mr. Vance, as the personal secretary, would have had ample opportunity to ensure those glasses were enhanced. A subtle application of a cobalt-based glaze to the interior of the lenses would be invisible to the wearer under normal light, but under the glare of a magnesium flare, it would turn the world into a blue-tinted hallucination. The doorbell rang, cutting through the explanation. I checked the glass. It wasn't one of the Vipers this time. It was a delivery man in a grey uniform, carrying a large, flat crate addressed to Nero Wolfe. I went to the door, signed for the package, and brought it back into the office. "This from Saul?" I asked, reaching for the crowbar I keep in the hallway closet. "Open it," Wolfe commanded. Inside the crate was a large, heavy mirror, its frame a gilded monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a palace. But the glass wasn't silvered, it was dark, almost black, and when the light hit it at a certain angle, it shimmered with a faint iridescent blue. Saul tracked this down in a warehouse in Queens, Wolfe said, his eyes bright with a rare, cold fire. It is a black mirror, an 18th century device used by landscape painters to simplify tonal values. But this one has been modified. Look at the backing, Archie. I turned the mirror over. Attached to the rear of the frame was a series of small electronic components, a battery pack, a timer, and a specialized bulb that looked like it had been salvaged from a high-end photography studio. "It's a remote-controlled flash," I said, the pieces finally starting to click. Vance didn't need to be in the room. He just needed this mirror to be there. He puts it in the library, sets the timer, and waits for Thorne to arrive. When the flash goes off, Thorne is blinded. The cobalt on his glasses reacts with the magnesium, and Vance, what? He walks through the wall. No, Archie. He walks through the door, Wolfe corrected. The locked room was a masterpiece of misdirection. The bolt was real, and it was thrown, but it was not thrown by Julian Vane. It was thrown by a mechanism synchronized with the flash, and the natural death. Julian Vane didn't die of a heart attack. He died of shock, terror-induced cardiac arrest, triggered by a sudden, blinding eruption of light in a room he believed was a sanctuary. To a man with a weak heart and a paranoid mind, it was the arrival of the very demons he spent his life trying to outrun. I leaned against the desk, my head spinning. So Vance orchestrates a light show that kills the old man and hides the theft of the will at the same time. And he uses Thorne as the perfect witness to swear the door was bolted the whole time. It's brilliant, Wolfe, but we still don't have the will, and we don't have a way to prove Vance was the one who set the timer. We have the will, Archie. We have always had the will, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of profound certainty. A man like Sterling Vance doesn't burn a document of that magnitude. He preserves it as a leash. He didn't come here to steal the soot. He came here to see if I'd realized that the will wasn't paper at all. Not paper? Then what was it? Wolfe looked at the shard of cobalt glass. It was the glass itself. The will was etched onto the surface of the mirror, hidden in plain sight behind a layer of tinted glaze. When the magnesium flashed, it didn't just blind Thorne, it developed the image for the camera Vance had hidden in the hedge maze book. The paper will was a decoy, burned in the fireplace to satisfy the vipers. The real will is a photograph, and the original is currently sitting on my desk. I looked in the mirror again. Under the office lights, it was just a dark, empty surface. But I knew Wolfe. He wouldn't have brought that gilded monstrosity into the house if he didn't already have the developer ready. Call them, Wolfe commanded, his eyes closing. All of them, the vipers, the secretary, and the lawyer. I want them here at 6, and tell Fritz that the leg of lamb must be seasoned with rosemary and garlic. We are about to witness the final act of the Greenwich illusion, and I find that the smell of burning vanity always pairs well with a robust roast. I reached for the phone, my fingers steady, but my mind racing. The scorpions were coming back to the cage, and this time the glass was going to be very, very clear. The office was primed, not with the overt weaponry of the police, but with the psychological architecture that Nero Wolfe preferred. He sat in his throne of red leather, a glass of beer at his elbow, watching the clock with a serenity that I knew was a front for a mind operating at high pressure. I had spent the afternoon following a series of cryptic instructions that involved a darkroom kit, a bottle of specialized solvent, and a high-intensity lamp ID borrowed from a contact in the forensic department. The gilded mirror Saul had recovered sat on a sturdy easel in the center of the room, draped in a heavy velvet cloth like a monument awaiting its unveiling. The guests are arriving, Archie, Wolfe said, his eyes not moving from the door. Ensure the seating is as I specified. Mr. Vance is to be placed directly facing the mirror. The Vane children are to be grouped to his left. Mr. Thorne will sit at the small table near my desk. You're setting the stage for a command performance, I noted, checking the load in my Marley one last time. I hope the script is as good as the set design. Vance is a cool customer he's not going to fold just because you show him a piece of dark glass. He will not fold because of the glass, Archie. It will fold due to reflection. A man who relies on illusion is always the most terrified of a clear perspective. The vipers arrived in a cluster of expensive coats and even more expensive resentment. Arthur Vane looked like he was ready to sue the entire block. Madeline was pale and stiff. Gregory looked like he needed a drink or a nap, preferably both. Silas Thorne, however, looked like a man who had already seen the gallows. He took his seat at the small table, his hands trembling as he adjusted those thick gold-framed reading glasses. Sterling Vance was the last to enter. He moved with a grace that was too fluid for a secretary, his eyes immediately locking onto the draped object in the center of the room. Mr. Wolfe, Arthur Vane began, his voice tight. This is the third time we've been summoned to this house. The Greenwich police are finishing their report. The district attorney is convinced my father died of natural causes. If you have more of these theatrical distractions, I suggest you save them for your orchids. Natural causes is a convenient label for a complex reality, Mr. Vane, Wolfe said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. Your father's heart stopped, yes, but it stopped because it was given a shock that the human frame was not designed to withstand. He died in a locked room, but he did not die alone. He died in the company of a ghost he had helped create. Wolfe shifted his gaze to Sterling Vance. The Greenwich illusion was a collaborative effort. Julian Vane wanted a way to disappear to leave his life and his children behind, while he watched their ruin from a safe distance. He hired you, Mr. Vance, to build him a doorway. You provided chemistry, glasswork, and stagecraft. You even helped him draft the joke will that would serve as the catalyst for the Viper's descent. Vance didn't move. An interesting theory, Mr. Wolfe. But Julian is in a casket. If there was an illusion, it ended with his pulse. It ended with your betrayal, Wolfe corrected. You realized that Julian's plan to disappear was flawed. If he lived, you were merely an accomplice. If he died, you were the architect of a vacuum. You modified the equipment. The magnesium flash Julian intended to use as a diversion for his exit became the weapon that ended his life. And the will, the document that Silas Thorne saw on the desk, it was never paper. Julian wanted something more permanent, more botanical in its complexity. Wolfe nodded to me. I stepped forward and gripped the velvet cloth. The room went silent. I pulled the cover away. The dark mirror shimmered in the amber light of the office, its surface black and impenetrable. "Observe, Mr. Thorne," Wolfe commanded. "Put on your glasses, the ones you were wearing that night in Greenwich." Thorne hesitated, then slid the gold frames onto his nose. Wolfe clicked a switch on his desk. A beam of ultraviolet light hit the mirror. At first, nothing happened. Then, as I began to apply the solvent with a steady, sweeping motion, a series of white etched lines began to crawl across the black glass. It wasn't a diagram of a garden. It was text neat, legal, and unmistakably Julian Vane's signature at the bottom. The cobalt glaze, Wolfe explained, his voice rising in power. Invisible under normal light, but permanent when etched into the glass. When the magnesium flashed, it acted as a photographic developer, burning the image into the lenses of Mr. Thorne's glasses and into the camera you had hidden in the hedge maze book. You didn't burn the will in the fireplace, Mr. Vance. You burned a stack of blank bond paper. The real will is standing in front of you. Madeline Vane let out a strangled gasp. Arthur took a step toward the mirror, his face a mask of disbelief. But my eyes were on Sterling Vance. The secretary's mask had finally shattered. He wasn't looking at the will, he was looking at Wolfe with a mixture of hatred and profound intellectual shock. "You couldn't have known," Vance whispered. "The timing, the reaction." "I knew because you're a man of vanity," Wolfe said, leaning forward. "You came to this house to see if I had found the soot. You left a smudge of magnesium on my desk. You wanted me to know how clever you were." A fatal error. In this office, cleverness is a common currency. Integrity is the only thing that holds value. Wolfe looked at me. "Archie, call Inspector Cramer. Tell him the natural causes in Greenwich have been upgraded. And tell him to bring a technician who understands the properties of etched cobalt. We have a document to process and a prisoner to deliver." Vance didn't fight. He didn't run. He sat back in his chair, a man who had been outplayed at his own game. The Vipers were silent, realizing that the botanical foundation was now a reality, and their inheritances had vanished into the black glass of a dead man's mirror. "The performance is over," Wolfe said, closing his eyes. "Archie, see them out. The smell of burning ambition is starting to interfere with my appetite, and Fritz has been very patient with the lamb." As I led the shell-shocked group toward the door, I looked back at Wolfe. He was already reaching for his glass of beer, the master of the house returning to his sanctuary. The Greenwich illusion was over, and the truth, as always, was much colder than the trick. The office had become a pressurized chamber, and the final hiss of air escaping was the sound of Arthur Vane's breath leaving his lungs in a ragged gasp. Inspector Cramer had arrived with the kind of promptness that suggested he had been circling the block, waiting for the signal that Nero Wolfe had once again done the heavy lifting for the local precinct. Pearlie Stebbins followed him in, looking as solid and unimaginative as a brick wall, his eyes immediately fixing on Sterling Vance. Wolfe didn't move. He remained behind his desk, a mountain of yellow silk and stubborn intent, watching as Cramer surveyed the room. The inspector's gaze moved from the etched mirror on the easel to the shattered expression on Vance's face. Cramer took a cigar from his pocket, looked at it, and then jammed it into his mouth without lighting it. He knew the rules of the brownstone smoking unless you were invited, and Wolfe wasn't in an inviting mood. "So," Cramer growled, his voice like gravel in a blender, Goodwin says you've got a murder, a missing will, and a magic trick all wrapped up in one. I hope for your sake, Wolfe, that the DA doesn't need a degree in optics to understand the charges. The charges are elementary, Inspector, Wolfe said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. Mr. Vance utilized a high-intensity magnesium flash to trigger a terror-induced cardiac arrest in a man with a known heart condition. He then relied on the momentary blindness of the only witness, Mr. Thorne, to manipulate the perception of the crime scene. The bolt on the library door was a motorized sham synchronized with the flash. The will was never stolen, it was hidden in plain sight, etched onto the surface of that mirror using a cobalt-based glaze. It is a matter of biology and chemistry, both of which are quite indifferent to the skepticism of the district attorney. Vance didn't look at Cramer. He was still staring at the mirror, or perhaps at the ghost of the man he had murdered. The cold, intellectual mask he had worn for years was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a gambler who had bet his life on a single card and watched the dealer pull an ace. Stebbins moved in, his handcuffs clicking with a metallic finality that seemed to echo in the quiet office. As they led Vance toward the door, the secretary didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The Greenwich illusion had been his masterpiece, and now it was his epitaph. Arthur Vane stepped forward, his face a mask of pale fury. And the will? If that thing on the mirror is real, what happens to the estate? To the firm? The firm will survive, Mr. Vane, Silas Thorne said, his voice shaky but regaining some of its legal iron. He had taken off his cobalt-stained glasses and was rubbing his eyes as if he was seeing the world for the first time in days, but the bank accounts will not. If the etching is verified, Mr. Wolfe has already provided the solvent to do South Botanical Foundation becomes the sole beneficiary. Your father's final joke has been delivered, and I intend to see that it is executed to the letter. Madeline Vane let out a sound that was half sob, half snarl, and stormed out of the office without a word. Arthur followed her, his Ivy League Polish finally rubbed raw by the realization that he was now a very well-dressed beggar. Gregory lingered for a moment, looking at the mirror with a strange, lopsided grin. He seemed less upset about the money and more amused by the fact that the old man had one from the grave. He nodded to Wolfe, shrugged at me, and wandered out into the hallway. Cramer stayed behind for a minute, looking at Wolfe with a mixture of respect and profound annoyance. I'll have the technicians take the mirror and the glasses. I'll need a full statement from Panzer about where he found the magnesium residue. And Wolfe, next time you decide to solve a billionaire's murder, could you do it without the 18th century painting equipment? It makes the paperwork a nightmare. I do not choose the tools of the criminal, Inspector. I merely identify them, Wolfe remarked, already reaching for his glass of beer. The paperwork is your burden. My burden is to maintain my sanity in a world populated by vipers and illusions. Archie, see the inspector to the door. I believe I hear Fritz in the kitchen, and the rosemary is becoming quite insistent. I showed Cramer and his men out, the brownstone feeling suddenly gloriously empty. The tension that had been building since Silas Thorne first rang the bell had evaporated, replaced by the familiar, comforting routine of the house. I could hear the clatter of pans from the kitchen and the distant, muffled roar of the city, but inside, the air was still. The case was over, the vipers had been defanged, and the locked room had been opened not with a key, but with a clear perspective. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was already deep in his beer. He looked at the empty easel where the mirror had stood, then at me. The mirror, Archie. Did the technicians handle it with care? As much as they handle anything, I said, sitting at my desk. But it doesn't matter. The truth is out, and the Botanical Foundation is going to have a lot of tulips to plant. You know, Vance was a hell of a secretary. If Head put that much work into his filing system, He'd probably be a vice president by now. Vance was not a secretary. He was a man who confused cleverness with power, Wolfe said, closing his eyes. He believed that because he could manipulate the sight of others, he was superior to the truth itself, a common delusion, and a fatal one. Now, Archie, if you have finished your summary of the obvious, I believe the lamb is ready, and tell Fritz that for dessert I should like the poached pears. I find I have a sudden, inexplicable craving for something that hasn't been etched in cobalt. I reached for the phone to check the bank balance one last time before dinner. It was a good day's work, and the Viper's loss was our gain just in the fee. but in the satisfaction of seeing a locked room turned into an open book. As the chime for dinner rang, I stood up and stretched, the academic fog of Greenwich finally behind us. The dining room of the old brownstone was a place where the jagged edges of the world were strictly forbidden to enter. Fritz had outdone himself with the leg of lamb. The scent of rosemary and garlic was a warm, aromatic blanket that settled over the mahogany table, making the cold, clinical details of the Greenwich murder seem like a bad dream from which we had finally woken. Wolfe sat at the head of the table, his napkin tucked into his collar with the solemnity of a high priest preparing for a ritual. He didn't speak while he ate to Wolfe. A meal is a conversation between the palate and the plate, and any verbal interruption is a breach of etiquette. I sat opposite him, my own appetite finally catching up with the day's events. The silence was thick but comfortable, broken only by the rhythmic clink of silver against china. It wasn't until the salad had been cleared and the poached pears had made their appearance that Wolfe finally leaned back, his eyes half closing in a state of postprandial grace. "The geometry of guilt," Archie Wolfe said, his voice a deep, melodic rumble that seemed to come from the very floorboards. "It is a fascinating study. Most men, when they set out to commit a crime, think in linear terms, a direct path from motive to execution. But Sterling Vance thought in layers. He didn't just want Julian Vane dead, he wanted the reality of that death to be a masterpiece of misdirection. He was a man who lived in the reflections of others, and it was only natural that he would choose a mirror as his weapon. He nearly pulled it off, I noted, spooning up a bit of the pear syrup. If Saul hadn't found that magnesium in the flue, we'd still be debating whether a heart can stop just because a door is bolted. It was the residue that did him in. No matter how much you scrub a crime scene, the atmosphere always keeps a record. Wolfe grunted, a sound of mild agreement. The atmosphere and the ego. Mr. Vance's primary error was his belief that his intellectual superiority was a shield. He could not resist the urge to return to this house to see if I had deciphered his illusion. He wanted to taste the satisfaction of having outplayed me, even as he was trembling with the fear of discovery. It is the paradox of the clever criminal. They require an audience to validate their genius, yet that very audience is the instrument of their ruin. "And the vipers?" I asked. Arthur and Madeline looked like they were ready to bite each other's heads off on the way out. "Thea going to be spending the next 10 years in probate court, trying to break that etched will." "Let them," Wolfe said, a rare, wintry smile touching his lips. "Mr. Thorne is a man of the law, and he now has the physical evidence to support the deceased's final intent. The botanical foundation will flourish, and the Vane children will find that their father's joke has a very long punchline. There is a certain poetic justice in the fact that Julian Vane's money, which was cultivated in the dark soil of corporate greed, will now be used to grow flowers in the sun." I leaned back, feeling the warmth of the room and the weight of the day finally beginning to lift. "It's a hell of a way to make a living, Wolfe. One day we're looking at orchid roots, and the next we're explaining how a piece of dark glass can kill a billionaire. Do you ever miss the days when a murder was just a guy with a blunt instrument in a dark alley?" "I do not miss the primitive, Archie. I merely tolerate the complex. A blunt instrument is a failure of the imagination." Sterling Vance, for all his moral bankruptcy, at least provided a puzzle that was worthy of my time. He treated the laws of optics as if they were his personal servants, and it was a pleasure to remind him that the truth is the only constant in a world of variables. Fritz appeared with the coffee, the steam rising in delicate curls that matched the ornate carvings of the sideboard. Wolfe took his cup with a silent nod of thanks. The house was quiet again, the sanctuary restored. The mirror was in the hands of the police, the vipers were in their limousines, and the secretary was in a cell. The Greenwich illusion had been dismantled, and what was left was the solid, immovable reality of the brownstone. The fee, Archie Wolfe reminded me, his eyes now fully closed. Mr. Thorne's cheque was merely a retainer. Given the complexity of the optics and the risk to my own reputation, I believe a supplementary invoice is in order. Julian Vane's estate is now a charitable trust, but charity begins at home specifically. This home. I'll have it on Thorne's desk by tomorrow morning, I promised, with a surcharge for intellectual wear and tear. And I'll make sure to mention that the truffles were an essential part of the investigation. Wolfe didn't reply. He was already drifting into that state of suspended animation he enters after a successful case, a mental hibernation where the only thing that matters is the next meal and the next orchid. I finished my coffee, looking at the empty space where the easel had stood. The office was just an office again, and I was just Archie Goodwin, the man who kept the scorpions in their jars and the bills in their folders. "Good night, boss," I said, standing. "Good night, Archie. And remind Fritz that for breakfast I should like the brioche." I find that a day of illusions always leaves me with a craving for something substantial and undeniably real. I headed for the stairs, the quiet of the house a final, peaceful punctuation to a week of shadows and light. The vipers were gone, the mirror was broken, and as far as Nero Wolfe was concerned, the world was exactly the way it was supposed to be. The office was finally a sanctuary again. The amber light of the desk lamps had reclaimed the room from the harsh, clinical intrusion of the police photographers and the frantic, hollow energy of the Vane family. I sat at my typewriter, the keys clicking with a rhythmic finality that usually signaled the end of my day and the beginning of my night. The report for the district attorney was almost finished, and it was a masterpiece of narrative economy, though ID left out the part where I thought Wolfe's truffles were the real catalyst for the solution. Wolfe was in his chair, a bottle of beer at his elbow and his eyes fixed on a small volume of poetry that I knew he'd be finished with by the time he went to bed. He looked like a man who had never heard of Greenwich, let alone a billionaire who died in a locked room. The transition from active detective to sedentary philosopher was complete, and as far as he was concerned, the case of the Greenwich illusion had already been relegated to the archives of human folly. "You know, boss," I said, pausing to light a cigarette, "I was thinking about that mirror. If Vance hadn't been so obsessed with making it a work of art, he probably would have gotten away with it. He could have just burned the will and been done with it. Why go to all the trouble of etching the glass and setting up a magnesium flash?" Wolfe didn't look up from his book. "Because, Archie, a man like Sterling Vance does not seek merely to succeed. He seeks to dominate. To a man of his temperament, a simple theft is a pedestrian act, a chore for a common thief. He wanted to prove he could control his peers' senses. He wanted to stand in a room and make the truth vanish, not through force, but through the application of his own superior intellect. It was a crime of vanity, and vanity is the one thing that the truth cannot tolerate. "Still," I said, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling, "it's a lot of work for a guy who ended up in handcuffs. He could have just been a really good secretary and retired on a pension. Now he's going to spend the rest of his life in a room where the only illusion is that the food tastes like anything other than cardboard." "Mr. Vance was never a secretary," Wolfe remarked, turning a page. "He was a parasite who mistook himself for a puppeteer. He believed that Julian Vane's wealth gave him the right to rewrite reality, and he discovered, as many have before him, that the laws of physics are not subject to the whims of the ambitious." The magnesium burned brightly, Archie, but it was the soot that remained. There is a lesson in that for those who care to look for it. "I'll stick to the bank balance," I said, glancing at the check Silas Thorne had delivered by messenger earlier that afternoon. "It's a lot more solid than magnesium soot. And speaking of solid, the Botanical Foundation has already announced its first project. Thea building a public conservatory in the Bronx. Thea naming it after Julian Vane, though I suspect head rather they named it after his favorite stock ticker. Wolfe made a sound that might have been a grunt of approval. A conservatory. A place where the environment is controlled for the benefit of the plants rather than the owner's ego. A marked improvement over the Greenwich Library. I may even visit it, provided they don't have any dark mirrors or bolted doors. "I'll drive you," I offered, "but only if you promise not to try and fix their watering system. I think one day of horticultural crisis per week is my limit." The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the soft, distant hum of the city. It was the kind of silence that Nero Wolfe paid for with every ounce of his energy and intellect. It was a silence that meant the world was, for the moment, in its proper place. The vipers were silenced, the mirror was shattered, and the brownstone was once again a place where the only thing that mattered was the quality of the beer and the health of the orchids. Wolfe closed his book and looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight, the hour when the house finally settled into its true self. He stood up, the slow, monumental rising that always made me feel like I was witnessing a tectonic shift, and looked around the office one last time. "The case is closed, Archie," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. The report is finished, the fee is secured, and the truffles were, as you noted, quite fresh. I believe we have earned the right to a night of uninterrupted sleep, and Archie... Remind Fritz that for breakfast tomorrow I should like the blueberry pancakes. I find that a day of illusions always leaves me with a craving for something that is exactly what it appears to be. Blueberry pancakes it is, I said, standing up and reaching for the light switch. And ill make sure the berries are real. We wouldn't want any more optical saturation before noon. Wolfe didn't reply, but as he stepped into the elevator, I caught the faint, wintry smile again. The Greenwich illusion was a dead issue, a story for the morning papers and the legal journals. For us, it was just another day on West 35th Street, and the only thing that was truly real was the quiet of the house and the promise of a good breakfast. I turned off the office lights, the darkness settling over the room like a comfortable old coat. The scorpions were in their jars, the truth was in the file, and as far as Archie Goodwin was concerned, it was a hell of a way to make a living. I headed for the stairs, the silence of the brownstone a final, peaceful punctuation to a week of shadows and light. The vipers were gone, the mirror was a memory, and as I reached the top of the landing, I found myself thinking that even in a world of illusions, there's nothing quite as solid as a job well done.